The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero when Maya Torres finally flipped the sign on the front door of Bernie's diner from open to closed. Her feet ached from the double shift she'd pulled, covering for Jessica, who'd called in sick for the third time that week, and the tips had been miserable because who goes out to eat when the weather tries to kill you just for stepping outside? She could see her breath inside the diner, even though the heater was cranking at full blast, fighting a losing battle against the brutal February cold that seeped through every crack and crevice of the old building. Maya had worked at Bernie's for almost 3 years now, ever since she'd dropped out of community college when her mom got sick, and she knew every inch of this place, from the permanently stained coffee pot to the booth in the corner where the vinyl was torn and patched with duct tape. The diner sat on the edge of Millbrook, a town so small you could drive through it in under 5 minutes if you didn't catch the single traffic light, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, and opportunities were as rare as warm days in winter. She grabbed her coat from the hook in the back, a thin burgundy jacket she'd bought at the Goodwill 2 winters ago, the lining torn in places and the zipper that stuck halfway up, but it was all she had. As she counted out the register, Maya's mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting for her at home in the cramped apartment above the hardware store, the ones printed in red with words like final notice and immediate payment required. Her mother's medical bills had piled up faster than snow in a blizzard, each one a reminder of the cancer that had taken her 6 months ago, leaving Maya alone with debt that seemed to grow with interest faster than she could work. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she finished her closing duties, wiping down the counter for what felt like the 1,000th time that day, refilling the salt and pepper shakers, making sure everything was perfect for Bernie, who'd come in at 5 a.m. to start the breakfast prep. She thought about her car, a 1998 Honda Civic that made concerning noises whenever she turned left, and whether it would start in this cold or if she'd be walking the 6 blocks home through the kind of weather that made your lungs burn with every breath. Maya pulled her jacket tight and pushed through the door into the assault of wind and ice that was waiting outside, and that's when she saw him. An old man sat huddled against the brick wall of the building next door, which had been a hardware store until it closed down last spring, and he was shaking so violently that at first Maya thought he was having a seizure. He wore nothing but a thin flannel shirt over what looked like 2 other shirts, pants that were more holes than fabric, and shoes that had separated from their soles in places, the kind of falling apart that happens when you've been wearing the same pair for years beyond their intended lifespan. His skin had taken on a grayish-blue tint that made Maya's nursing training from her 1 semester at community college scream alarm bells in her head, because she knew what hypothermia looked like, and this man was dangerously close to it. She stood there for a moment, frozen herself but not from the cold, watching him try to pull his thin arms tighter around his body in a futile attempt to generate warmth that simply wasn't there. The wind howled down the empty main street, picking up snow and hurling it sideways, and Maya knew without checking the weather app on her phone that the temperature was still dropping and would hit 20 below before morning. The man's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, and she realized with growing horror that if someone didn't do something, this man might not survive the night right here on the sidewalk of her small town, where nothing ever happened except people leaving and never coming back. Maya had seen homeless people before, of course, even in Millbrook, where most folks knew each other. There were always those who'd fallen through the cracks, lost jobs, or families, or hope, or all three, but she'd never seen someone so completely unprepared for weather that could kill you in hours. She looked up and down the empty street, hoping maybe to see someone else, someone with more resources or authority, or just a car with a heater, but there was nobody, just her and this dying man, and a choice she'd have to make in the next few seconds. Her practical mind started running calculation immediately, the ones she'd gotten so good at over the past few years, the constant arithmetic of poverty, where every decision had to be weighed against its cost. Her jacket was the only real winter coat she owned, the only thing between her and the same cold that was killing this man, and she'd need it to walk home and to get to work tomorrow, and for the rest of this endless winter that seemed determined to break her. Maya sat on the edge of the enormous bed holding her coat and cried, really cried for the first time since her mother died, all the grief and stress and fear of the past months pouring out in great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Thomas Blackwell, who died alone despite all his money, for her mother who died after fighting so hard, for herself and the life she'd been living, the constant terror of poverty and the weight of debt and the grinding exhaustion of trying to survive. She cried because everything had changed and she didn't know who she was anymore, if she was still Maya Torres the waitress or someone else entirely, someone who owned this house and billions of dollars and a future that extended beyond the next paycheck. The coat still smelled like Bernie's diner, that mix of coffee and grease and the cheap air freshener Bernie used to cover it up, and Maya pressed it to her face and breathed in that familiar scent, grounding herself in something real and known. She thought about the old man Thomas Blackwell, trying to imagine what his life had been like, how someone could have everything and still end up lost and alone on a freezing sidewalk. She thought about the daughter he'd mentioned in his letter, the one who'd died 5 years ago, and the grief that must have hollowed him out, how wealth couldn't fix that kind of loss any more than it could have saved her mother. Maya stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the snow-covered estate, the gardens and paths and the forest beyond, all of it hers now, though the concept still felt abstract and impossible. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out what came next, meet with lawyers and accountants, learn how to manage wealth she couldn't comprehend, make decisions about businesses and investments and 100 other things she knew nothing about. But tonight she was still Maya Torres, still the girl from Millbrook who'd given her coat to a stranger, because it was the right thing to do, and that person, that core of who she was, hadn't changed even if everything else had. She pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time before finally calling Bernie's diner, letting Bernie know she wouldn't be coming back, trying to explain without really explaining, and listening to his confused questions that she couldn't answer. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know this is sudden, but something came up, something big, and I can't come back." 3 months later, Maya Torres stood in front of the Millbrook Community Center, a building she'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing it, and watched as construction crews began the renovations that would transform it into a homeless services facility. Unlike anything the county had ever seen, she'd spent the past 12 weeks in meetings and classes, learning about wealth management and investment strategies and philanthropy, from people who'd made careers out of helping wealthy people manage their money. And while the numbers still sometimes made her dizzy, she'd discovered she was good at this. Good at asking questions and challenging assumptions and pushing for real solutions instead of half measures. The Blackwell Foundation, as she'd named it, would focus on homelessness and mental health services, building facilities in small towns that were always overlooked when funding got distributed to cities, creating programs that treated people with dignity instead of just warehousing them. She'd kept Thomas Blackwell's businesses running, mostly because shutting them down would have put thousands of people out of work. But she'd made changes, raising wages and improving benefits, and listening to workers who'd been ignored for years. The estate she'd kept because it felt important somehow to maintain it as Thomas Blackwell had wanted, but she'd opened parts of it to the public, turning the library into a community resource and the gardens into a park where anyone could visit. Maya had paid off her mother's medical bills first thing, sent checks to everyone who'd been kind to her over the years, set up a scholarship at the community college she'd had to leave, and still had more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. She thought about Thomas Blackwell often, about the strange twist of fate that had put them both on that sidewalk on the coldest night of the year, about how one moment of kindness had changed everything for both of them. Her burgundy coat hung in her closet at the estate, carefully preserved, a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd chosen to be when it mattered most. Robert Castellano pulled up in his car, arriving for their weekly meeting to go over foundation business, and Maya smiled because she'd found purpose in this unexpected life, found meaning in using wealth to help others the way she'd once been helped. The story that had started with a freezing man on a sidewalk had become something bigger, a legacy that would outlive both Thomas Blackwell and Maya herself, proof that kindness rippled outward in ways you could never predict, and good things sometimes did happen to good people. Maya's fingers moved to the buttons of her coat before her brain had fully committed to what she was doing, working the cheap plastic through the buttonholes, with hands that had started to shake, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the enormity of what she was about to do. She'd been taught to help people back when her mother was alive, and they'd volunteer at the church soup kitchen every Thanksgiving, back when Maya still believed that good things happened to good people, and the universe somehow kept score. Her mother used to say that kindness was the only thing you could give away and still keep, One of those sayings that sounded nice but didn't hold up when you were drowning in medical debt and working doubles just to keep the lights on. But standing there in the brutal cold, watching this man who might be someone's father or grandfather literally freezing to death, Maya found she couldn't walk away, couldn't step over him and head home to her apartment, even though every practical bone in her body screamed that she couldn't afford this, couldn't afford the cold or the risk or the consequences. She slipped the jacket off her shoulders and immediately the wind cut through her thin waitress uniform like it wasn't even there. The polyester button-down and black pants that made up Bernie's required outfit, providing exactly zero protection against weather that was actively trying to kill anything warm-blooded. Maya knelt down beside the man, her knees immediately soaking through with the wet snow that had accumulated on the sidewalk, and gently touched his shoulder. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, and she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 70 or 75, with a lined face that spoke of a hard life and grey stubble that had grown out into a patchy beard. "Sir," Maya said, her teeth already starting to chatter. "Sir, you need to take this," and she draped her coat over his shoulders before he could protest or refuse or tell her all the reasons why she shouldn't be doing this. The man looked up at her with eyes that took a moment to focus, to understand what was happening, and when comprehension finally dawned, those eyes filled with tears that immediately froze on his weathered cheeks. "You can't," he said, his voice rough and broken. "You'll freeze." But Maya was already standing up, already committing to this decision even though she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. "There's a shelter," Maya lied, because the nearest homeless shelter was in the next county over, 3 blocks that way. "You need to get there tonight, okay?" The walk home normally took Maya 8 minutes, if she moved at her usual exhausted post-shift pace, but tonight every step felt like moving through concrete, her body already shutting down non-essential functions to conserve heat that was bleeding out of her faster than she could generate it. The wind came in gusts that knocked her sideways, and the snow had picked up until it was a full whiteout, those tiny ice crystals that felt like needles against any exposed skin. Maya's arms were wrapped so tight around her body that they ached, but it did nothing to stop the shaking that had started in her core and radiated outward, the violent trembling that her body used as a last-ditch effort to generate warmth. She'd made it 2 blocks before she started to realize she might have made a catastrophic mistake, before the cold stopped being uncomfortable and started being painful, a deep, bone-aching agony that made it hard to think about anything except how much everything hurt. Her fingers had gone numb first, then her toes, and now her face felt like it belonged to someone else, all sensation replaced by a burning numbness that she knew from her limited medical training was extremely bad news. Maya thought about turning back, about going to pound on someone's door and begging for help, but pride and stubbornness kept her moving forward, 1 foot in front of the other, because she'd made her choice and she'd live with it, assuming she lived at all. The streets of Millbrook were completely deserted, everyone with any sense staying inside where it was warm, where hypothermia was just a word and not an imminent threat. She passed the post office, the library, the insurance agency where her high school friend Tracy worked, all of them dark and closed and offering no sanctuary. Maya's mind started to drift in the way that meant she was in serious trouble, thoughts becoming disconnected and strange, and she found herself thinking about her mother, about the day they'd found out about the cancer, about how her mother had smiled even then, and said everything would be okay. Nothing had been okay, of course. Her mother had died anyway, despite the treatments they couldn't afford, despite Maya dropping out of school and working every hour she could, despite prayers and hope and all the things that were supposed to matter. The cold was making her angry now, angry at the universe for being so consistently cruel, angry at herself for giving away her coat, angry at a world where an old man could freeze on a sidewalk and a young woman could work herself to death and nothing ever got better. Maya woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of her alarm, her whole body aching like she'd been hit by a truck, a throat raw, and her head pounding with the beginning of what was definitely going to be a terrible cold. She'd made it home last night, barely, stumbling up the stairs to her apartment and standing in a scalding shower for 40 minutes, until she could feel her fingers again, until the shaking stopped and her core temperature climbed back up from wherever it had fallen to. Now sitting at her tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea warming her hands, Maya wondered if she'd actually helped that old man, or just condemned them both to misery. She needed to get to work in an hour, needed to show up for the morning shift even though her body felt like it was made of lead, and her head was so stuffed up she could barely breathe through her nose. Bernie didn't do sick days, not really. He'd make sympathetic noises, and then remind you that the diner couldn't run itself, and someone had to cover your shift anyway, so you might as well drag yourself in. Maya pulled on her work clothes, the spare uniform she kept clean for emergencies, and stared at the empty hook where her coat should be hanging. She'd have to wear her spring jacket, the thin denim thing that was maybe good for temperatures down to 40 degrees, but would be absolutely useless in the current Arctic blast that showed no signs of letting up. The weather app on her phone, which she checked with a sense of growing dread, showed that today would be even colder than yesterday, with a high of -5 and wind chills that could cause frostbite in under 10 minutes. Maya made herself breakfast, toast with the last of her peanut butter, and tried not to calculate how many shifts she'd have to work to afford another winter coat, how that expense would push back paying the electric bill, how pushing back the electric bill might mean coming home to a dark, cold apartment. The domino effect of poverty was something she understood intimately, how one small disaster could cascade into a complete catastrophe faster than you could say emergency fund, which was laughable because who had emergency funds when you were barely making rent? She finished her tea and headed out into the cold, the thin jacket doing basically nothing against the wind, and started the walk to Bernie's diner, her body already shaking again, already regretting the kindness that had seemed so necessary last night. The morning rush at Bernie's was exactly what Maya expected, a steady stream of regulars getting their coffee and eggs before heading to work, the same faces in the same booths ordering the same things they ordered every single day. She moved through her shift on autopilot, refilling coffee and taking orders and running food from the kitchen, her body screaming at her to rest but her bank account demanding she keep moving. By 10 a.m., when the breakfast crowd had thinned out and Maya was refilling the ketchup bottles, a man walked in who definitely didn't belong in Millbrook. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 months, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, a cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders, and shoes so shined they reflected the overhead lights. He was maybe 50, with silver hair styled in that casual but expensive way, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about money a day in his life. The man looked around the diner with an expression Maya couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and emotion, and then his eyes landed on her and he smiled like he'd just found exactly what he was looking for. "Maya Torre?" he asked, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to being listened to, and Maya felt her stomach drop because the only time someone asked for you by name in her experience was when you were in trouble. She nodded slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Had she done something wrong? Was this about her mother's medical debt? Had that old man from last night died and somehow she was responsible? The man reached into his coat and pulled out a manila folder, and Maya's hands tightened on the ketchup bottle she was holding because this was it. This was the other shoe dropping, the universe collecting payment for her moment of kindness. "My name is Robert Castellano," the man said. "I'm an attorney, and I represent the estate of Thomas Blackwell, the man you helped last night." Maya's mind went blank for a second, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to connect the dots between the freezing homeless man and this lawyer who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "Is he okay?" she asked, because that was the only thing that mattered. Did he make it to the shelter? Robert Castellano's expression shifted to something softer, almost sad, and he gestured to a booth. "Could we sit down? There's something I need to tell you." Maya slid into the booth across from Robert Castellano, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and the lawyer opened the manila folder with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Thomas Blackwell was not homeless," he began, and Maya's confusion must have shown on her face, because he continued quickly. "He was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest men in the state, the founder of Blackwell Industries." Maya's brain short-circuited trying to reconcile the man she'd seen last night, shaking and blue with cold in rags, with the concept of a billionaire, someone with resources beyond imagination choosing to freeze on a sidewalk. "I don't understand," she said, and her voice sounded small and lost even to her own ears. Robert pulled out a photograph, and Maya recognized the old man immediately, but in the picture he was younger, maybe 60, wearing an expensive suit and shaking hands with what looked like a senator or governor. Thomas had early-stage Alzheimer's, Robert explained, his voice heavy with grief that sounded genuine. He'd wander sometimes, get confused, end up in places without knowing how he got there, and last night he walked away from his care facility during a shift change. The lawyer pulled out more documents, medical records and incident reports that Maya couldn't focus on because her mind was still spinning. He died at 4:30 this morning, Robert said quietly, at County General Hospital, complications from hypothermia and pneumonia, but he was conscious until the end, and he told us what you did, how you gave him your coat, how you helped him. Maya felt tears burning in her eyes because she hadn't helped him, not really. She'd given him a coat, but he'd died anyway. And what good was kindness if it didn't change anything? Before he passed, Robert continued, reaching into the folder again. Thomas changed his will. He'd been planning to update it anyway. His daughter passed away 5 years ago, and he had no other heirs. But your act of kindness, a stranger giving away her only coat on the coldest night of the year, it meant something to him in those final hours. The lawyer slid a legal document across the table, pages and pages of text with words like beneficiary and assets and numbers that Maya's exhausted brain couldn't process. Thomas Blackwell has left you his entire estate, Robert said, and the words seemed to come from very far away, like Maya was hearing them underwater, or through a wall. His house, his investment portfolio, his business holdings, everything, it's yours now. We're still calculating the exact total, but we're looking at somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion depending on market valuations. Maya laughed, actually laughed, because this had to be a joke, some elaborate prank that she didn't understand, because things like this didn't happen to people like her, working-class girls from nowhere towns who dropped out of college and waited tables to survive. That's not possible, she said, and her voice sounded strange, high-pitched and disbelieving. People don't just give away billions of dollars to strangers. Robert pulled out another document, a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, the shaky writing of someone very old or very sick. He wrote this last night at the hospital. He wanted you to understand why. Maya took the letter with hands that shook worse than they had in the cold, and she read words that blurred as her eyes filled with tears. Thomas Blackwell had written about dying alone, about how wealth had isolated him, how everyone in his life wanted something from him, how in 75 years no one had ever given him something without expecting something in return. You gave me your coat, he'd written in that shaky hand. You gave me the only thing protecting you from the cold. You gave it freely without knowing who I was or what I could do for you. You saw a human being who needed help and you helped. And that simple act of grace reminded me that goodness still exists in the world. The letter went on, explaining his decision, how he'd rather his wealth go to someone who demonstrated true character than be fought over by distant relatives who only saw him as a bank account. The lawyers will handle everything, Robert said, his voice gentle as Maya tried to process words that seemed to rearrange reality itself. The house, the investments, the business interests, will guide you through it all, but effective immediately. You're one of the wealthiest people in America. Maya looked around the diner, at Bernie's scratched countertops and worn booths, at the life she'd been living just minutes ago, and felt the walls of that life crack and fall away, everything she'd known about how the world worked dissolving like snow in the sun. Maya walked out of the diner in a daze, Robert Castellano following at a respectful distance as she tried to make sense of what had just happened, tried to fit this impossible reality into the mental framework of scarcity and struggle that had defined her entire adult life. Bernie had been surprisingly understanding when she'd told him she had to leave, though he'd looked skeptical when she said it was a family emergency, probably assuming she was lying to get out of her shift, not knowing that her entire life had just been turned inside out. The cold barely registered now, her thin jacket inadequate as ever, but her mind too overwhelmed to process physical discomfort, when her entire understanding of reality had been demolished. "There's a car coming to pick you up," Robert said, checking his phone. "It should be here in about 5 minutes. We've arranged for you to stay at the Blackwell estate while we sort out the legal details. You'll need to meet with accountants and lawyers, and there's about 1 million decisions to make, but nothing has to happen today if you're not ready." Maya turned to look at him, this stranger who'd walked into her life with news that seemed more like a fever dream than actual events. "Why didn't anyone find him?" she asked. The question that had been burning in her mind since Robert first told her who Thomas Blackwell really was. If he was so wealthy, why was he alone on the street? Robert's face clouded with guilt and grief. The care facility where he lived is very exclusive, very private. They're not supposed to let patients wander, but there was a shift change, and he slipped out. We've been searching for him for hours. We had police and private security looking everywhere. But he'd walked almost 3 miles in the cold, and by the time we tracked his movements, he was already with you. The lawyer paused, seeming to struggle with emotion. In a terrible way, you gave him something no amount of money could buy. You gave him dignity in his final hours. You treated him like a human being worth saving, and that meant everything to him. A black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot, so new and expensive it looked like something from a different dimension compared to the beat-up trucks and aging sedans that normally filled Bernie's lot. "That's for you," Robert said. "The driver will take you wherever you want to go, and I've taken the liberty of having some things delivered to the estate, clothes and necessities, everything you might need." The Blackwell estate sat on 200 acres outside the city, behind walls and gates that opened automatically as the car approached, and Maya pressed her face to the window like a child seeing something impossible made real. The house itself was something out of a movie, a sprawling stone mansion with wings and towers and more windows than she could count, every one of them glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness. The circular driveway was bigger than the parking lot at Bernie's, and a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and practical clothes waited at the massive front door as the car pulled up. "I'm Margaret," the woman said as Maya climbed out of the car on legs that felt disconnected from her body. "I've been Mr. Blackwell's household manager for 20 years, and I just want to say how grateful I am for what you did." Margaret led Maya through rooms that seemed to go on forever, each one more elaborate than the last, filled with antiques and art and the kind of casual luxury that came from generations of wealth. "We've prepared the blue bedroom for you," Margaret said, climbing a staircase so wide 10 people could walk up it side by side. "But you can choose any room you like. The house has 32 bedrooms. They passed a library that had more books than Maya had ever seen outside of a public library, a music room with a grand piano that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, a dining room with a table that could seat 50 people. Maya's mind couldn't absorb it all, the sheer scale of wealth on display, the casual opulence that someone had lived with every day while she'd been counting pennies and wondering how to pay her electric bill. The blue bedroom was larger than her entire apartment, with a 4-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a palace, walls covered in silk wallpaper, and windows that overlooked gardens buried in snow. "There are clothes in the closet," Margaret said, opening doors to reveal more clothing than Maya had owned in her entire life. "I had to guess at sizes, but we can have alterations done tomorrow, and anything you don't like we can donate." On the bed was her burgundy coat, cleaned and repaired, the torn lining fixed and the broken zipper replaced. "Mr. Blackwell was holding it when he passed," Margaret said softly, tears in her eyes. "He wanted to make sure it was returned to you."